So JFK pointed out that a message of peace should not be controversial or difficult to make. What indeed should be difficult to make is the message of war. However, today, peace has nonetheless become taboo across the West, especially in our current proxy war against the Russians. And we have effectively criminalized diplomacy and negotiations, which is the condition for peace. So I will give you an example from Europe, what is going on this side of the pond, as the European Union has always considered itself a peace project. And whenever there has been a conflict around the world, the European Union always advocates for the same solution, which is to revive diplomacy and negotiations, end the bloodshed as soon as possible, and start talking. One doesn't have to agree on everything, but at least one has to start talking. This has always been the recipe, but until war came to Europe. Now it's not anymore. In the current conflict we have with Russia, the EU now openly rejects diplomacy and negotiations as has chosen war as the only path to peace. Again, Hungary, who now holds the rotating presidency of the Council of the European Union, recently made a visit to Ukraine and Russia to explore this possibility for restarting diplomacy and even negotiating an end to the war. However, the EU condemned it. They said our objective should be to isolate Russia and not give it legitimacy by talking to them. So Hungary is now even being punished by the European Union for its diplomatic peace mission. And the EU consensus, which is now coerced, is to reject any diplomacy. That is, we don't talk to the opponent. And our media has equally become very complicit. Our newspapers covering it tend to leave out that the Hungarian prime minister went to both Russia and Ukraine, and instead they tend to focus on his trip to Russia only in order to smear him as a stooge of President Putin. So this is the narrative-driven media, and what they're pushing is always conflict. Now, I argue that ideology can have a devastating impact on peace. So when we speak of ideology, it tends to be a system of ideas, beliefs, and values to organize society. And this in itself does not have to be a bad thing. Indeed, our guiding ideologies will have many positive components. Liberalism, democracy, human rights, ideals which we should cherish as well as protect. However, what we often see is that this translates into a wider ideology by linking it to an entity of power, in which perpetual peace depends on promoting liberal democracy under the condition of Western hegemony. And herein lies, I argue, the danger of ideology, as the makeup of society is also renowned for being often used as a tool for power and control and to justify divisions and conflict between groups. It can be used to mobilize the public against a dehumanized adversary. In short, ideologies, once you explain not the world as competing interests, but good versus evil values, then we represent the good values, adversaries represent the evil opposite. So no longer is there any real room for compromise. And we see that whenever we aim to take out an adversary, reality is often simplified and dumbed down. It is always done then in the name of freedom, democracy, or human rights. We see this with the crippling sanctions on Venezuela, invasion of Iraq, occupation of Syria, the destruction of Libya, the threats of a war against Iran, the current proxy war against Russia, and also the future war against China. Every time we see that liberal democratic values are often used to sideline international law. And this is the great contradiction of this, how liberalism as an ideology has been used. Because human rights and democratic mandates in the international system, it was intended to create a more peaceful system. Why? It would restrict or restrain the actions of governments by having to take into account human rights as well as respect the self-governance of other countries. But instead, we see it's now enabling coercion against other governments. So whenever we want to do some sanctions, coups, invasions, we always cite our values. And this is quite dangerous. And it's important to understand that for much of the world, when they hear us speak of democracy and human rights, they usually assume that we're already loading the bombs on our planes.
Glenn Diesen is a professor at the University of Southeastern Norway, USN, and an associate editor at the Russia in Global Affairs journal. Diesen's research focus is Russia's transition from the Greater European Initiative to the Greater Eurasian Partnership. Diesen has previously published 10 books, a multitude of journal articles, and is a frequent contributor to international media. The war in Ukraine is a symptom of the collapsing world order, revealing the dysfunction and illegitimacy of the West's liberal hegemony. A Westphalian world order is reasserting itself, although with Eurasian characteristics. The negative aspect of think tanks is the power they wield, from controlling information to functioning as a waiting room for politicians out of office. Information is power, and a think tank's business model has been established that sells political influence in Washington and manufactures consent among the public. The military-industrial complex is the dominant donor to think tanks, which results in a bias toward military solutions and perpetuating conflict.